Hello, my name is Harzing and I'm a professor of international management, staff development lead and research mentor at Middlesex University, London. This recording is part of a set which makes up the preparation for the Middlesex University Writing Bootcamp. If you haven't watched the earlier recordings yet, I suggest you do so before watching this one. In the first 6 recordings, we first of all discussed how submitting an article to a journal can be seen as contributing to a scholarly conversation. So it is really important to select the right journal and ensure you embed your paper in the conversations that are going on in that journal. Then, in the next 4 sessions, we looked systematically at 4 key sections of the manuscript that are absolutely crucial to get right in your first submission. The title, the abstract, the introduction and the conclusion. We also discussed how to use references strategically in your manuscript. And finally, we discussed the importance of writing a good letter to the editor and having your paper proofread. In this recording, I will show you some examples of effective titles, polished abstracts and conclusions that end on a high note. In the live sessions of the bootcamp, we work together on transforming titles, so I'll also show you some title transformations from prior bootcamps. Finally, we'll look at some examples of transformed abstracts. Okay, starting off, here are some examples of what I consider to be effective titles. Titles that are both descriptive and memorable. Here are a few examples of titles that I've used in my own papers. The first one is actually the title of my first ever paper, and the paper was about how everyone in the field had assumed that expatriate failure rates were really high, and when I traced back the literature it turned out that there was really no foundation for this. So I used the word myth to attract people's attention. Then the second one was an analysis of the detrimental effects of ranking universities and academics. And we tried to use a nice alliteration when knowledge wins, and then the sense and nonsense to alert people that this is a nicely provocative paper. Then the third one, a classic, like a slightly provocative, cute first title of bears, bumblebees and spiders, and then a descriptive subtitle, the role of expatriates in controlling foreign subsidiaries. And the bears, bumblebees and spiders were metaphors for different ways of controlling foreign subsidiaries. Then the fourth one, that was another play on words, in that we used a main title in different languages because the article was about the role of language differences and language barriers in the communication between headquarters and subsidiaries. So we thought it would nicely illustrate language barriers. This slightly backfired because one of the reviewers actually said there is a mistake in the title because it's not in English. So this reviewer clearly didn't get the joke. And then this one I already referred to in the previous slides, one of my former PhD students, Shefan, the benefits of being understood. So a slightly metaphorical main title. The role of ethnic identity confirmation in knowledge acquisition by expatriates. So really descriptive, slightly boring subtitle. This one is the other way around, a main title that really descriptive, really boring, document categories in the ISI Web of Knowledge. You already fall asleep reading it. But then a provocative subtitle, Misunderstanding the Social Sciences. So in that article I show that the way that the Web of Knowledge classifies articles really shows that they have no clue how the social sciences operate. This one is about geographical diversity of editorial boards, and it has the main title Practicing What We Preach. So in our field we preach diversity, but do we also show this in the editorial boards of our journals? Then another article, which was actually an update of my very first article, also on expatriate failure rates, But to attract even more attention, I had a fairly provocative main title: Are our referencing errors in fact undermining our scholarship and credibility as academics? And that certainly drew the attention. Then there's a series of 3 papers that are all about Microsoft Academic, which is a specific data source, just like the Web of Science and Scopus and Google Scholar. I wrote 3 papers on this when it was still very new. So I started out with a paper, A Phoenix Arisen from the Ashes, because it was initially introduced a few years ago, then closed down and then reintroduced. So A Phoenix Arisen from the Ashes. And then the second one was Is the Phoenix Getting Wings? It was okay, this is now starting to develop and the Phoenix is starting to fly. And then the third and last one was when the data source was 1 year old, and I talked about the Phoenix being ready to leave the nest as an adult. Then this one, again, about the Web of Science, Thomson Reuters Web of Science, but a specific element of it, the essential science indicators, with again a really provocative main title. Health warning might include multiple personalities. It's actually more puzzling than provocative. It refers to the fact that the Web of Science can't distinguish one Asian scholar from another. So the top ranked scholar in the Web of Science is in fact an amalgamation of about 500 academics with the same name, Yan Wang. And then finally, and this is not an officially published paper, it's simply a white paper on my website, so that's why I had even more freedom in choosing the title, The Mystery of the Phantom Reference, a detective story. So this was about a reference that was repeatedly used in articles, but didn't actually exist at all. So it was just a phantom. And this was a detective story about how we figured out that, first of all, this reference didn't exist, but how it became to be referred. So by referring it this way, a lot of people paid attention and actually started to read the article. Next up, abstracts. I'll give you 5 examples of abstracts that include all the elements that we have discussed in the recording on abstracts. Research background, research gap, research topic, the theory you draw on, if any, the method you are using, the key results of your study, and the implications of your study for research, practice, or policy. Most journals have strict word count for their abstracts. This particular journal, the British Journal of Management, had a fairly lenient 200 words, so we had a bit of space here. The article was about gender diversity, or rather the lack of gender diversity, in editorial boards of journals. We started out by painting the background and the research gap, indicating how female academics continue to be underrepresented on editorial boards, but not on editorial boards of all journals, so problematizing the context. Subsequently, we clearly defined what our research topic was and emphasized that we were going to look at the characteristics of journal editors, because journal editors are the most influential people in the selection of editorial board members. Then we clearly explained the theories that we were drawing on, social identity theory and homosocial reproduction theory, and explained that we positioned this article in the gender and careers literatures. After this, we explained our method in some detail and emphasized that we had longitudinal data at 5 points in time, but also created a multi-level model. Then we clearly outlined our results and showed that the prospect of board membership for women improved when editors are high-performing, professionally young or female. And then finally, we emphasize the implications of our study for management journals with low, stagnant or declining representation of women on their boards. The next example is an example for a journal with a very strict word count, 100 words, the Journal of World Business. This particular article introduced a new concept to the literature, ethnic identity confirmation. The topic of the article was the role of shared ethnicity between expatriates and host country employees. We first outlined the background and showed how sharing an ethnicity with host country employees is increasingly used by multinational corporations as a selection strategy. We then showed that there had been very little research in this area so far, and then clearly defined our research topic, indicating that we drew on identity perspectives, so indicating the theory that we draw on, but then clearly identifying the new concept in our paper, ethnic identity confirmation, so that this was clear to the reviewers from the start. We then briefly discussed our research methods and the results in the same sentence, indicating that we were focusing on experiments, which is a rather unusual research method in management, and indicated the key results in our study. The next article also comes from the Journal of World Business, so again a very strict word count, 100 words. Rather than emphasizing the introduction of a new concept, as we did in the previous slide, the emphasis of this paper is really on the data, so having a really unique data set. As usual, though, we started out with outlining the background, emphasizing the importance of language differences in multinational corporations. Then, emphasizing the data, we outlined the research gap and topic as saying this would be the first large-scale quantitative overview of language competencies, policies and practices in multinational corporations. The methods sentence then also emphasized again the data set, outlining that there are data from more than 800 subsidiaries in 13 different countries and headquarters in more than 25 different countries. And also indicates that we aggregated these into 4 distinct home country clusters, thus indicating some of the results already. So then we summarized the results and the implications in this one sentence, indicating that because the study was so comprehensive, we could really differentiate prior conceptual and case-based findings according to different home and host countries and the use of different types of corporate languages, which had important managerial implications. So the next example is about a different type of paper again, a review paper. This paper was about the challenges that academics experience in international survey research. So the background simply listed this. Then we went into a bit more detail about the exact research topic, and we indicated the specific issues and the specific challenges that we were going to discuss in this article. Subsequently, we looked at the methods and the results. The methods were basically a review of the literature, but also giving examples from our own research projects. And then finally, the implications were that by applying these recommendations, the quality of international survey research would improve. The fifth and final example comes from a completely different field, bibliometrics. This article is about Thomson Reuters' Web of Knowledge and indicates that it really grew from a science-based background, so it doesn't really accommodate for the distinctiveness of social science research. As a background, I first established that this data source is used in the majority of benchmarking analysis and bibliometric research projects. So as a research gap, I indicated that it is important to be aware of the limitations of the data provided by the Web of Knowledge implicitly indicating that this hasn't been done before. So the specific research topic was looking at the classification of documents in the web of knowledge, where classifications used are original article, review, or proceedings paper. What I did is look at 27 journals in 9 of the social science and science disciplines over a period of 11 years. And what I found was that although the classification as a proceedings paper, so a conference paper, or a review article, so an article not including original research, did work well in the sciences and did correctly classify articles, it didn't work well in the social sciences and it misclassified articles. So I argue that this presents a misunderstanding of research and publication practices in the social sciences. Next up, let's look at some examples of conclusions. In the recording on conclusions, I emphasized that you really need to end the article on a high note. So don't end your articles with the limitations of your study and all the future research that needs to be done. No, end your article with the key contributions of your own study. The first example is of a really short concluding section. Sometimes articles have a strict word count, so you don't have a lot of space for the concluding section either, or it might be customary to have short concluding sections in the journal that you are aiming to publish in. So in this conclusion, we kept it high level. We had a high level summary indicating that our study was the first large-scale empirical analysis of language barriers in multinational corporations and the solutions to language barriers. We then indicated the results, but again, really on a high level. We didn't discuss all of the 13 solutions we found in detail. We just said they mirror the conceptual article, but also that it is important to mix and match the solutions. And then finally, we provided again a high-level managerial implication indicating that the most important thing was to take language barriers seriously. And that was the condition for MNCs to really tackle the language barrier and increase their competitiveness. So the second example is the counterpart of the same study where I discussed the introduction before, where we introduced a new concept, ethnic identity confirmation. Because the importance of the new concept was crucial, the concluding section was also theory focused. We briefly outlined the research background and a gap that we contributed to, indicating that we focused on the experience of host country employees rather than expatriates themselves. Then we clearly outlined what we did in the article and focusing specifically on the concept that we introduced. We then summarized the research methods. We used a quasi-experimental method and gave the high-level results. Again, we didn't go into details. We just indicated that ethnic identity confirmation is a facilitator influencing employees' attitudes towards expatriates. And then finally, we really emphasized the wider conceptual and theoretical implications, indicating that the new concept that we introduced captures a really overlooked interpersonal dynamic, and that this new perspective would be really important in the interactions between expatriates and host country employees. So every element of the conclusion focuses on this new concept that we introduced. So the next example is about an article about geographic diversity in editorial boards of journals. In this article, we really wanted to have an action-focused conclusion, but to do this, we first needed to show why action was important. So first of all, we started the conclusion by saying that an emphasis on formal research evaluation means that more academics are expected to publish in top journals. but that their ability to do so might be compromised by the fact that gatekeepers in these journals are part of a dominant group, and in this case, Anglo-American academics. So we indicated that it is important, and this was the research gap, to understand the level of international diversity in editorial boards, as well as the factors influencing the diversity. So then we had the high-level results indicating that there has been some progress in increasing international diversity, but also, and that is the high-level action summary, that we need continued active management by editors, but also professional associations and individual academics to make sure that editorial boards reflect our diverse management community. The fourth example focuses on future research. And I know I told you that you shouldn't focus on future research in your conclusion, but with that I meant that you shouldn't say that lots of future research is needed because my study was so limited, so we can't really draw any conclusions from it. In this article, we focus on what we have found in our study and how that changes future research. So in this study, we basically argued that the concept of cultural distance has become far too dominant in international business, and that it might be more important to look at the specific characteristics of home country and host country. So we summarize our contribution, first of all, in the concluding section, and we also implicitly summarize the methods that we used in the study. Then we also look at the actual results we found in terms of home and host country and how they impact on the phenomenon that we studied in the article, which is entry mode choice. We also indicate, though, that our results are not just focused on this phenomenon, but also might be important for other dependent variables in international business. And then we have a clear call for action, recommending that future studies in international business really focus on home and host country first and don't just plug in cultural distance in their regression analysis. And we then argue that this is really important because if we don't look at the key concepts carefully, our ability to provide proper guidance to managers on international business phenomena is compromised. Then a fifth and final example is from a completely different discipline, scientrometrics or bibliometrics. And this article looks at comparing research performance across disciplines. So the sciences, the life sciences, engineering, the social sciences, and arts and humanities. And prior research in this field had always assumed that it wasn't possible to compare research performance across disciplines. And in our article, we have a strong advocacy element indicating that it is actually possible as long as you use the right data source and the right metrics. So the first part of the concluding section simply summarizes what we have done in the article. The next part of the summary then indicates the first result, which is a fairly boring result about the stable quarterly growth of the three databases. But this was meant to establish that in contrast to what prior studies had thought, Google Scholar is actually a credible data source to measure research performance. We then discussed the takeaway from this first result, before going to the second result, which was our key result, which showed that both the data source used and the specific metrics used completely changed the conclusions that can be drawn from cross-disciplinary comparisons. So then our final takeaway with a strong recommendation and advocacy was that we can actually have cross-disciplinary comparisons of research performance that are both fair and inclusive as long as we use Google Scholar or possibly Scopus as a data source. and a HI annual, which is a H index corrected for career length and co-authorship, as a metric. Next up, I'm going to discuss some title transformations. These are examples of actual titles that Middlesex colleagues have brought to bootcamps in the last 4 years, and I show how they have been transformed in the bootcamp through discussions with colleagues. I won't spend a lot of time on each individual title as the slides are pretty self-evident. There are about a dozen of them, so it gives you a good overview of what you can do to transform your titles. First up, a title in the area of human resource management, where the original title was really long, included an overload of nouns, and was really quite unclear. It's quite typical of the type of titles that as academics we start out with. The two new titles are much catchier, much shorter, and much more meaningful. In the next example, the first iteration was fairly similar, too long, lots of nouns, unclear focus, too many concepts. The key focus of the article was technology transfer, not human resource development, not knowledge management. Also, the first iteration didn't include a type of analysis, qualitative comparative analysis, which was very new in international business at the time and was specifically suitable for small samples, which this article had. So the new title is much more attractive, clearly focuses on the key topic and the method of analysis. Next example, again, too many nouns, unclear what the key contribution of the article is. It doesn't indicate that data were collected in 3 countries, so it doesn't indicate the key contribution of the study. It also doesn't differentiate it from other studies in the field. So the new title looks much more attractive, emphasizes the key contribution, and distinguishes it from other studies in the field. Next example, similar issues, too many nouns, too long, not clear what the exact focus is, and also quite boring and sleep-inducing. What is the role of technology in facilitating and enhancing? It doesn't really grab you. So the new titles are much shorter. What is the role of has changed to through. In the field of teacher education has changed to pedagogy. And the title is also much more assertive, rather than facilitating and enhancing, which sounds a bit like weasel words, it's developing. In the next example, the original title is actually not too bad. It scans well, and I think it would have attracted quite a bit of an audience for the article. However, the author was a bit concerned that some readers might be put off by the word feminist in the title, even though after reading the article they might actually appreciate the feminist approach. She also thought that dialogue sounded a bit non-committal, as if there was no final resolution in the article, and it didn't really communicate that the article was really critical in nature. She also thought that the title could be shorter. So the new title she came up with, Poor Women's Empowerment Through Microfinance in Malaysia, a Critique, is shorter, more attractive. And here is another example from an original title that is probably too long, includes too many nouns, vague words, and overall is a little boring, to be honest. Alternative approaches to, examples from, it doesn't really excite the reader. Even more importantly, the contribution of the paper and the conversation that it contributes to was unclear. It talks about offshoring, about global scanning. Is it maybe about the country context or the industry context? And the new title really shows that the article contributes to the conversation of subsidiary roles in R&D internationalization, which was the key conversation that the article wanted to contribute to. The new title also gives an indication of what the research question is and what the key findings are, that the subsidiaries might be either strategic or a black hole. So overall, a much more effective and attractive title. And here is another example of an old title that, although not as long as some of the previous ones, still had an overload of nouns and wasn't really clear about what the key contribution of the study was. The dynamics of labour share really wasn't capturing what the issue discussed in the paper was. The issue in the paper was the decline of labour share. It also didn't include all the key concepts that were important in the article. There was no reference to technology, and this was discussed in great length in the paper, so it's important to get it in the title as well. And perhaps even more importantly, the title, the original title, didn't really give an indication of what the independent or the dependent variable was, whereas the new title clearly identifies this. This is an example from an economics article, and the old title was really short. This is something that many economics journals seem to like, so that's not a problem. But United We Stand, it could be about almost anything in the world, so you have no indication at all what the article is about. So the author added a subtitle on the benefits of coordinated punishment. This still leaves a fairly short and catchy title, but the subtitle explains a bit more what the article is about, but it's still quite intriguing. The benefits of punishment sounds a little bit contradictory, so it invites further reading of the abstract at least. And coordinated punishment really sounds like this might be a specific concept. So anyone who's working in either coordination or punishment is going to want to read at least the abstract to see what this article is about. So overall, a good transformation, I think. Next up, an article in entrepreneurship. Very similar problems to some of the previous titles. Not really clear, too many nouns. It didn't fit with typical titles in the target journal. And there were two concepts in the title, but it wasn't clear what the independent and the dependent variable was. It also didn't mention the research methods and sample in the title. So it really sounded a bit like a conceptual paper, building a theory. Whereas the key contribution of the article actually was that it was a large-scale empirical study. Finally, it also sounded rather too modest and tentative, building. We probably don't succeed, so it needed to be more assertive. How entrepreneurship influences social progress, clear what the independent and dependent variable is, a configurational approach, which is a research method, across countries. Very clear that it is a large-scale research project. Next up, an article in organizational behavior on identity. Again, the old title had rather too many nouns linked by prepositions. It, strangely enough, didn't even mention the core concepts in the article, which was about compassion. It also didn't mention the approach that was used in the article, psychosocial approach, which is actually one of the key contributions of the paper. So the new title was really more agentic and active, so less kind of passive and boring, as a social defense rather than social defenses in. It clearly mentions the key focus, the approach, and the fact that this is about nurses' identity, which was the key topic of the article. Next up, I'll give you 3 examples of transformations of abstracts that occurred in prior bootcamps. I'm only giving you 3 examples. There were obviously many more, but it is really hard to get a whole abstract on a slide, so I've limited this to 3. The first example is an article in destination branding, a frequently researched topic in tourism. The key problem with the original abstract was that the opening sentence really focused on the over-researched topic of destination branding rather than establishing the broader societal context and indicating why destination branding is important in local economic development, which was the new abstract. The second sentence also didn't really work well because it mentioned a 5th dimension, which was the dimension discussed in the paper, but it didn't mention the other 4, so the context was completely lost. Most importantly, the abstract really didn't give a clear indication of the research gap, which is really crucial in any abstract. There were lots of boring details about the data collection and analysis that really don't need to be in an abstract. So the revised abstract looks much more attractive and included all the elements that you would normally like to see in an abstract. If you want to read this in any detail, I suggest you just pause the slide here. The second example is also in tourism, but this one is in tourism education. The key problem here is that the abstract is far too long, and this is a really great example how cutting words actually clarifies the contribution of the study. And this sounds really counterintuitive. You would think that if you use more words, the contribution is clearer, but that's not the case. So the new abstracts really focused on the what, why, and how and when of the paper. So eliminating many words, clearer and punchier abstract. Again, if you want to look at this in detail, I suggest you pause the slide here. The third and final example is the abstract of the economics article that we discussed earlier, United We Stand. This one, again, the abstract needed to be shorter because in this case, the journal that it was to be submitted to, American Economic Review, had a really strict word count of 100 words. But in addition to cutting words, the article, the abstract also needed to be clearer about the key contribution of the article. It started out, the old abstract, with an investment game, which is quite common in the literature already. So the coordinated punishment, which was really the key contribution of the article, needed to be early on in the abstract. Also, the original abstract included loads of information about the investment game, and this was really not necessarily for a more general audience that you would find in American Economic Review. So the final abstract was shorter, punchier and clearer. Again, if you'd like to look at this in more detail, I suggest you pause the slide here. You've made it to the end of nearly 3 hours of recording for the Middlesex University Writing Bootcamp. If you've only managed to capture the last recording, this recording with examples of titles, abstracts and conclusions, then remember that there are 6 different recordings preceding this recording. The first one looking at how submitting to a journal means contributing to a scholarly conversation. The second on writing effective titles. The third about polishing your abstract. The fourth about writing an effective introduction section. the 5th about ending your article on a high note by writing a good concluding section, and the 6th about writing a good letter to the editor. So, the end of the recordings. Happy writing. I look forward to seeing all of you in the live versions of the bootcamp. And if you're already about to submit an article, good luck.